When developers have long-running franchises, there's a temptation to make big changes to the game so that it feels new. Oftentimes, these additions to the game add a lot of fun. However, other times game makers can add features no one was asking for and nobody wants. You'll never guess which classic game is actually pretty disappointing today. Stay tuned to find out. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video to level up. SimCity. The city-building simulator series SimCity has been a PC gaming favorite since its original release in 1989. The fourth major release of the game was, appropriately, SimCity 4, which was the culmination of everything the previous games had accomplished, which was released in 2003. Opinions were pretty positive, though many reviewers claimed the game seemed rushed and more of an afterthought. So when the release of the next SimCity game was announced 10 years later, gamers were excited to see how they would reinvent the series and make it bigger than ever. However, many people had reservations to pick up the game when its new features were announced. SimCity could not be played offline, with no way around this. The main reason was because the developers at Maxis believed players would enjoy building their cities with friends online. Of course, when the game launched, it was almost impossible to connect, and even when you could, the multiplayer seemed pointless. In order to make playing with your friends easier on your computer, they made a maximum potential size of the city much smaller than previous games. It seems that instead of trying to make the next great city builder, EA and Maxis were more interested in trying to make a game filled with features nobody asked for. Crash Bandicoot Wrath of Cortex. With the recent release of Crash Bandicoot N. Trilogy on the PlayStation 4, many of us have been revisiting our favorite orange mammal. Playing the original 3 games that were originally released in the late 90s also reminded us how bad the Crash games had gotten ever since Naughty Dog stopped developing them. With Sony and the original developers out of the picture, Traveler's Tales, who would go on to make the LEGO games, released the first Crash game that would be on PlayStation 2. Despite the updated visuals and sounds, the game still could not outpace the originals, and it seemed like it may be because they tried to do too much. While much of the game seemed to be simply remaking the original, they also let you play as Crash's sister, but it doesn't offer much in the way of variety. They attempt to mix things up in between levels by having you play through sequences and vehicles, but ultimately, it just becomes repetitive. Not to mention the load times were impossibly bad, making you wait 15 seconds every time. This was the beginning of the end of this franchise. A handful of games have been released on every system, but none have been able to recapture the platforming bliss of the originals. We are also excited to announce the Premium Network. The Premium gets you early access to videos from Screen Rant, CBR, The Gamer, The Richest, and many other great channels. Literally thousands of videos in one place with ad-free browsing. How sweet is that? Sign up for free the Premium by clicking the link to start binge-watching videos from your favorite channels. Assassin's Creed Unity. The Assassin's Creed series has had 18 games and even a motion picture, but these games still have some serious issues with packing too much into their games. Despite finding some critical success in Assassin's Creed 3, it seems like they lost their way again with 2014's Assassin's Creed Unity. Since this was Ubisoft's first attempt to make a game for the PS4 and the Xbox One, we understand that they may have had some troubles, but that's not a great excuse. With the game's release, there were a lot of technical issues which caused certain visuals to not load. Suddenly, everyone was sharing screenshots and video of skinless faces that just had floating eyes and teeth. Talk about nightmare fuel. Even when the game was working, it just felt like more of the same old same old. Climb a tower to synchronize your map to reveal hundreds of icons where you can partake in boring side missions. It somehow managed to be both underwhelming and overwhelming. We have high hopes for the newest Assassin's Creed Origins, which seems to be doing away with many of the things people have grown tired of after so many games. Which Assassin's Creed game is your favorite? Let us know in the comments below. Nioh. There have been many games that attempt to take what makes Dark Souls series so interesting and make their own game. Not many have succeeded, and most seem to miss the point completely. Team Ninja's Nioh actually seems to get pretty close, but still manages to make their game way too complicated for seemingly no reason. While Nioh definitely nails the difficult combat, punishing bosses, and interesting atmosphere, it seems they were out to make a complex game. First of all, some of the control options don't appear to have been designed for human hands, requiring players to claw over the controller or sometimes just forgetting how to do specific moves. There are many different types of weapons in the game, which is awesome, but just trying to learn one of them can be a major pain. A lot of frustration for this came from the fact that there are different stances that can cause different effects. Luckily, a lot of the mechanics the game pushes on the player can be completely ignored, but you may struggle to get through the game. There is magic, different fighting techniques, and a lot more that we haven't even scratched the surface on after 30 hours of playing. Fallout 4. To say people were excited for Fallout 4 would be quite the understatement. Bethesda's last major game was Skyrim, which was released 5 years prior. What was surprising was that Fallout 4's announcement was not too long before its release. The game we got seemed to be more of a Fallout 3.5 than a Fallout 4, as the visuals were similar and they didn't add too much in the way of interesting mechanics. They did, however, add some gameplay that was just added to pad out the game. Specifically, Fallout 4 had a base building mode where you could customize different settlements. While it was an interesting idea, they did not do enough to make it memorable. The idea of a home base in a game where the idea was combing an endless wasteland wasn't something we were looking for, and it mostly went forgotten. It isn't until you get about halfway through when the game forces you to care about base building in order to progress. Instead of trying to force players into building environments, we wish the developers would have put the time in to try and make more places for us to explore. It was even more disappointing when one of the 3 DLC releases was simply for base building. No Man's Sky. It was being advertised as the last video game you'll ever need, with literally countless randomized planets to explore. However, when gamers got their hands on No Man's Sky last year, they were quickly left with confusion and frustration. When looking at the gameplay shown prior to the release and the game we all got, it's clear some things were changed. The game, however, did make good on its promise of endless exploration. It just doesn't seem like what was put out gives much reason to continue. The systems of the game felt like they were just there to keep players from getting too bored, trying to learn alien languages, taking photos, and naming every living creature, mining resources, and more. We understand that making games is difficult, and a game as deep as this one is clearly no exception. But it feels like the developers forgot to make the game fun. For all the mechanics shoved into the game, it just didn't feel like there was much worth doing. It was just a lot of hoops to jump through before you were able to travel deeper and deeper through the universe, which is what people wanted to do in the first place. Dwarf Fortress. Now, this game is only for the most hardcore of gamers, people who are obsessed with the simulation of society. Dwarf Fortress is a PC game that was released into alpha in 2006. The concept behind the game is that it is meant to be the most in-depth civilization where seemingly anything can happen. The game doesn't even have actual art. If it did, it wouldn't run on most computers. Instead, the base game uses ASCII art, which has different colored keys from your keyboard representing everything. Luckily, fans of the game have created visuals more to what we are used to. You can either play as an individual dwarf through adventure mode and follow its complex life, or play in fortress mode, which has you controlling a collection of dwarves in real time. The game has gotten so complex that simulated societies in-game have learned how to build government, create alcohol, and even time travel. Many people have attempted to play Dwarf Fortress, but for most, it's just impossible to understand where the game is buried among all its mechanics. We understand that this sort of game might be fun for some people, it just isn't for us. Metal Gear Solid 5. The final installment of the Metal Gear Solid franchise, The Phantom Pain, turned out to be a different game compared to its predecessors. In some ways, this was a great thing, as it was a breath of fresh air, but to some fans, the 5th game forgot to include what made the original so unique, and instead added a lot of unwanted mechanics to fill the game out. Metal Gear Solid 5 was the first in the franchise to give players a more open world to play in. The way you scout out enemy camps for infiltration points and attach them in numerous ways made for a satisfying experience. A lot of fans felt the game had a weak story, and that more focus should have been put on that over the open-ended gameplay. Our biggest grievance was its overblown army building mechanic. It was cool to get to steal enemy soldiers and put them on your team, but then you had to babysit them and try to ensure you had the best possible squad. This was also the factor in your getting better equipment, so it wasn't really something you could ignore. Even worse, online players could invade your base and steal your soldiers. If this wasn't bad enough, the game's publisher Konami gave you the option to buy insurance with real money to help you save your soldiers. Final Fantasy 15. Final Fantasy 15 is a game 11 years in the making, and the time spent on the game shows, as it's different than any other Final Fantasy game. Much like Metal Gear Solid 5, the developers of this game decided to take a more open-world approach. This was a polarizing decision for most gamers. Clearly, Square Enix was trying to make a Final Fantasy for old and new fans alike. The game had players driving through the world of Eos, trying to connect the player character Noctis with his bride-to-be. He is accompanied by his 3 bodyguards, who each possess unique skills. The game boasts a lot of different things to do that don't seem to add up much to the game, besides a little personality and a minor distraction from the main game. From cooking to philosophy and even fishing, the game is often throwing things at you to do, when all you really want is to find the next story beat. Previous Final Fantasy games definitely felt more closed off and claustrophobic, but 15 really seemed to be a bit of an overcorrection. Did you play Final Fantasy 15? What did you think of it? If you loved it or hated it, let us know in the comments below. Donkey Kong 64. When we think back to our time playing games as kids, it's hard to forget the games made by Rare on the N64. After putting out hits like GoldenEye 007 and Banjo-Kazooie, it was pretty exciting to hear they were adapting Donkey Kong into 3D. They packed so much into this cartridge, Nintendo had to include an expansion pack to ensure the game would run properly. Sadly, it seems like a lot of what was included was too much, making this game almost impossible to finish 100%. An insane amount of collectibles, many of which were difficult to find, were included. You got to play as 5 different characters, but each one of them had their own collectibles that only they could get. You would constantly be switching characters just to grab a few bananas. This was very stressful for those who wanted to completely beat the game. Back then, we had a lot more time to spend on games, but trying to go back and replay this game today just feels stressful. The game had a lot of great ideas, but it really seemed like they wanted gamers to spend as much time as possible with the game, rather than wanting us to have fun. What do you think of these games that think more gameplay mechanics equals more fun? Did game developers go too far to try and make their games longer? Comment your thoughts down below, and of course, don't forget to subscribe and check out more great videos in our playlist. Thanks for watching!